Dust clung to everything. Greta Miller pressed her forehead against the window of the military transport truck, watching the flat Texas landscape roll past in waves of brown and yellow. The heat was different here. Dry, relentless, nothing like the damp cold of Bavaria she'd left behind. Or rather, that had been taken from her. She was 22 years old. 3 months ago, she'd been stationed at a communications post outside Munich, wearing the gray uniform of a Wehrmacht-Helferin, transcribing radio messages she barely understood. Then the Americans came. The surrender. The chaos. The long, bewildering journey across an ocean to a country she'd been taught to fear. Beside her, Sophie Hartman sat with her hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had gone white. At 28, Sophie carried herself with the careful composure of someone who'd learned to hold things together when everything else was falling apart. She'd been a teacher once, in Hamburg, before the firestorms, before the city became ash and rubble and the screaming silence of empty streets. On Greta's other side, Heidi Schneider fidgeted with the frayed edge of her canvas bag. 19 years old, with wide eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide their fear. She'd worked anti-aircraft batteries in Berlin, watching the sky fill with bombers night after night until the night the sky fell and the Russians came and everything ended. The truck slowed. Through the dusty windshield, Greta could see it now. The camp. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the scrubland surrounded by high fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers rose at intervals, silhouettes of armed men visible against the bright sky. It looked exactly like the photographs she'd seen in training, the ones meant to show them what happened to enemies of the Reich. Except now she was the enemy. The truck stopped with a lurch. An American soldier opened the back gate, his face neutral, professional. He said something in English. Greta caught maybe one word in 3. Her English was terrible. Sophie's was better. Learned from books before the war when such things still mattered. They climbed down, legs stiff from hours of travel. There were 8 of them in total, all women, all former auxiliaries. All prisoners now, though the Americans didn't use that word. Internees, detainees. As if softer language made the fences disappear. The intake process was mechanical. Photographs. Stand here, look forward, don't smile. Fingerprints. Press down, roll to the side. Next finger. Medical examination. Open your mouth. Breathe deep. Any symptoms of illness? Greta answered the questions she understood and stayed silent for the rest. A woman in a crisp uniform wrote things on a clipboard. Everything was documented, filed, processed. They were assigned to Barracks 14, a long wooden structure with a peaked roof, divided into sections. Inside, the air was stifling despite the open windows. Rows of narrow beds lined the walls, each with a thin mattress and a folded blanket. Other women were already there. German families, Greta realized, with children. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, stared at them with solemn dark eyes. An older woman approached, her face weathered but kind. She spoke in German, her accent thick with something Greta couldn't place. "You're from Germany? Just arrived?" Sophie nodded. "Yes, today. I'm Frau Weber. My family came from Peru last year. They brought us here because my husband was born in Stuttgart, even though we'd lived in Lima for 20 years. She gestured around the barracks. "It's not so bad here. Better than some places, you'll see. Better than some places." Greta wanted to laugh, but her throat was too dry. That evening they were taken to the mess hall for dinner. It was a large building, filled with long tables and benches. The smell hit Greta first. Food, actual food, not the watery soup and black bread that had been their rations for the past 2 years. Her stomach clenched with sudden, painful hunger. They moved through a line, each receiving a metal tray. An American cook, a large man with rolled-up sleeves, spooned portions onto their plates. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, a thick slice of white bread, and butter, real butter, a pat of it melting into the potatoes. Greta stared at her tray. This couldn't be right. This was more food than she'd seen in a single meal since before the war, since before everything. They found seats at a table near the back. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Heidi picked up her fork with trembling hands and took a small bite of the meatloaf. Her eyes widened. "It's real," she whispered. "It's actual meat." Greta tried the potatoes, creamy, rich, with the unmistakable taste of butter. Her mother used to make potatoes like this before the rationing, before they'd learned to stretch a single potato across 3 meals. She chewed slowly, trying to make it last, trying not to think about her mother standing in line for hours in the cold for a handful of turnips. Sophie ate mechanically, her face expressionless. But Greta saw the way her hand shook slightly as she lifted the fork, the way she paused between bites as if afraid the food might vanish. Around them, the mess hall buzzed with conversation in multiple languages. Greta heard German, yes, but also Japanese, Italian, even English. Families sat together, mothers with children, elderly couples, young women like themselves. The Americans had put everyone together, all the enemy aliens in one place. At a nearby table, a Japanese woman was helping her young son cut his meat. She caught Greta's eye and offered a small, tired smile. Greta nodded back, uncertain. They were all prisoners here, all far from home. The details didn't seem to matter much. That night, lying on her narrow bed in the darkness, Greta listened to the sounds of the barracks. Quiet breathing, someone crying softly, trying to muffle the sound, a child whimpering in sleep. Outside, the Texas night was alive with unfamiliar sounds. Insects, distant voices, the creak of the guard towers. She thought about the butter, real butter, given to prisoners, to enemies. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. Beside her, Sophie's voice came soft in the darkness. My grandmother died last winter in Hamburg. The rations weren't enough. She just got weaker and weaker until she couldn't get out of bed anymore. Greta didn't know what to say. What could anyone say? She would have cried, Sophie continued, her voice thick. If she'd seen that butter, she would have cried. In the morning, they learned the routines. Roll call at 7, standing in lines while American guards counted them. Work assignments. Greta was sent to the laundry, Sophie to the gardens, Heidi to the kitchen. They would earn 10 cents an hour, paid in camp script that could be used at the canteen. The canteen. Greta discovered it on the 3rd day, a small building stocked with items for purchase. Canned peaches, sugar in paper bags, coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd choked down in Germany, chocolate bars, soap, toothpaste, things that had become luxuries, impossibilities now sitting on shelves behind a counter. She bought a small bag of sugar with her first week's scrip, 5 pounds of white sugar, granulated and pure. She held it like treasure, feeling the weight of it, the impossible abundance. In Germany, 5 pounds of sugar would have been a month's ration for an entire family. Here, it cost 35 cents. The work was hard, but not cruel. In the laundry, Greta spent her days washing sheets and uniforms in huge vats of hot water, her hands turning red and raw. But there was soap, plenty of soap, and the clothes came clean. At midday, they stopped for lunch. Sandwiches, fruit, sometimes cookies. Cookies. Greta ate them slowly, trying to remember the last time she'd tasted something sweet just for the sake of sweetness. Sophie worked in the gardens, tending rows of vegetables under the brutal Texas sun. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans. The soil was different here, sandy and dry, but things grew. The Japanese families had their own garden plots growing vegetables Greta didn't recognize. Long white radishes, leafy greens, strange gourds. They worked with quiet efficiency, entire families moving through the rows together. One afternoon, an elderly Japanese man offered Sophie a cucumber, freshly picked and still warm from the sun. She took it with a bow, mimicking his gesture, and he smiled. They shared no common language, but the cucumber was crisp and cool, and for a moment the fences seemed less solid. Heidi worked in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing dishes. She was the youngest, and the American cooks seemed to take pity on her, sneaking her extra portions, teaching her English words. Potato, knife, careful, hot. She repeated them dutifully, her accent thick but earnest. In the evenings there were classes. English lessons taught by a stern American woman with gray hair and kind eyes. Mrs. Patterson. She spoke slowly, writing words on a blackboard, making them repeat phrases until the sounds felt less foreign. Good morning. Thank you. Please. I am sorry. Greta wondered if she would ever stop being sorry. Mrs. Patterson also taught home economics, cooking, sewing, household management, American cooking, which seemed to involve alarming quantities of sugar and butter. One afternoon she demonstrated how to make white bread, measuring out flour and yeast and sugar with casual abundance. "This much sugar?" Sophie asked, watching Mrs. Patterson dump a quarter cup into the mixing bowl. "For bread?" Mrs. Patterson smiled. "Just a little sweetness. Makes it rise better, and Americans like their bread soft. Soft bread, sweet bread. Bread that wasn't dense and dark and stretched with sawdust." Greta watched the dough rise, doubling in size, and felt something twist in her chest. The bread came out of the oven, golden and fragrant. Mrs. Patterson sliced it while it was still warm, the steam rising, and passed pieces around. Greta bit into hers and closed her eyes. It was soft, almost cake-like, with a faint sweetness that made her think of childhood, of her mother's kitchen before the war, before everything. "Next week," Mrs. Patterson announced, "we're going to make something special. A real American dessert. Peach cobbler." The women looked at each other, uncertain. Cobbler. None of them had heard the word. Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled. "You'll see. It's a treat. We're celebrating. The war in Europe is over. Time for something sweet. The war in Europe is over." The words hung in the air, heavy with meanings Greta couldn't untangle. Over. They had lost. Germany had lost. She should feel something. Grief, shame, relief. But there was only numbness and the lingering taste of sweet bread. The following week, Mrs. Patterson brought out the ingredients for peach cobbler. She lined them up on the counter like an exhibition. 2 large cans of peaches in syrup, their labels bright and cheerful. 2 cups of white sugar. A full cup of butter. Flour, cinnamon, nutmeg. Heidi stared at the display. All of this for one dessert? For one pan, Mrs. Patterson corrected. Which will serve about 12 people, but yes. Greta did the math in her head. 2 cups of sugar. In Germany, that would have been 2 months' ration for a family. Here, it was going into a single dessert. Mrs. Patterson demonstrated the process. Melt the butter. Mix the dry ingredients. Layer the peaches in a baking dish, their syrup golden and thick. Pour the batter over the top. Sprinkle with cinnamon. The smell as it baked was intoxicating, sweet and spiced and rich, filling the classroom until Greta's mouth watered despite herself. When it came out of the oven, the top was golden brown, the edges bubbling with caramelized peach syrup. Mrs. Patterson let it cool for a few minutes, then cut squares and served them on small plates. "Go on," she urged. "Try it while it's warm." Greta took a small forkful. The peaches were soft and sweet, the crust buttery and tender, the cinnamon warm on her tongue. It was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. It was obscene. It was impossible. It was everything she hadn't known she was missing. She looked up and saw tears streaming down Sophie's face. Silent tears, falling unchecked while she ate slowly, methodically, as if each bite was both pleasure and penance. Heidi had stopped eating altogether, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "My brother," she whispered. "My little brother in Berlin. He's 8 years old. He should taste this. Every child should taste this." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. "I hope someday he will." That night, Greta couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the cobbler, the impossible sweetness of it, the casual abundance. 2 cups of sugar, a full cup of butter, canned peaches from California or Texas or wherever they grew peaches in this vast, wealthy country that had so much it could give dessert to its enemies. She thought about her mother, standing in ration lines in the cold. Her father, thin and gray, trying to work the farm with no fuel for the tractor, no fertilizer, no help. Her younger sister, 12 years old, who'd written in her last letter about being so hungry she couldn't sleep. The guilt was crushing. Here she was, fed and housed and given butter and sugar and peach cobbler, while her family starved, while all of Germany starved, while the cities burned and the children died and everything fell apart. But underneath the guilt was something else, something she was afraid to name. Gratitude, relief, the shameful, selfish relief of being safe and fed while the world burned. She heard movement in the darkness. Sophie, sitting up on her bed, writing in her diary by the faint light from the window. Greta watched her for a moment, then spoke softly. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Sophie's pen paused. "I don't know. I don't know if there's a home to go back to. But if there is, if we do, how do we explain this? How do we tell them about the butter and the cobbler and the Americans who feed their prisoners better than we fed ourselves?" Sophie was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "Maybe we don't. Maybe we just remember that kindness exists, that abundance is possible, that the world doesn't have to be what we were told it was." In the morning, there was an announcement. A special dinner would be held in the mess hall to mark the end of the war in Europe. All internees were invited. There would be a full meal and dessert, peach cobbler, made in the camp kitchen, enough for everyone. The day felt strange, suspended. The war was over, but they were still here, still behind fences, still uncertain of their futures. Greta went through her work in the laundry mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Around her, the other women talked in low voices, speculating. Would they be sent home now? Would they be kept here? What was happening in Germany? No one knew. The Americans told them nothing, or perhaps they told them things in English that got lost in translation. Rumors spread like wildfire. Germany was destroyed. Germany was rebuilding. The Russians were coming. The Americans were in charge. Everyone was dead. Everyone was alive. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle, but the middle was a cold, uncertain place. Evening came. The mess hall had been decorated with small American flags and bunting. It felt surreal, almost mocking, celebrating victory over the very people they were feeding. But the smell of cooking food overrode everything else. Roast beef. The rich, savory aroma filled the building, making Greta's stomach clench with anticipation. They moved through the line. Each tray received a thick slice of roast beef, carrots, potatoes, a fresh roll. Greta found a seat with Sophie and Heidi at their usual table. Around them, the mess hall filled with families, German, Japanese, Italian, all the displaced and detained, all the enemies of America sitting together under one roof. The meal was eaten in relative quiet. People were hungry, and the food was good, and there was too much to think about to waste energy on conversation. Greta cut her beef into small pieces, chewing slowly, trying to make it last. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs she couldn't name. The carrots were sweet. The potatoes were creamy with butter. Butter. Always butter. The abundance of it still shocked her. Then the kitchen staff began bringing out the dessert. Large trays covered with cloth carried carefully, set on serving tables at the front of the hall. When they pulled back the cloths, Greta saw it. Pan after pan of peach cobbler, the tops golden brown, the edges bubbling with syrup, steam rising in fragrant clouds. The aroma hit her like a wave. Cinnamon and peaches and butter and sugar, all mixed together into something that smelled like comfort, like home, like everything good she'd forgotten existed. They served generous portions. Greta watched the server, a young American soldier with red hair and freckles, scoop a large square onto her plate. The cobbler was still hot, the peaches soft and glistening, the crust flaky and rich. She picked up her fork. Beside her, Sophie and Heidi did the same. For a moment, they all hesitated, as if afraid to break whatever spell this was. Then Greta took a bite. The sweetness exploded on her tongue. Not the harsh chemical sweetness of saccharin, but real sugar, pure and clean and overwhelming. The peaches were soft and warm, their flavor concentrated and intense. The crust melted in her mouth, buttery and tender, with the warm spice of cinnamon threading through everything. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted. It was too much. It was perfect. She laughed suddenly, unexpectedly, the sound bursting out of her before she could stop it. "Mein Gott," she said, her voice shaking. This is incredible." She took another bite, then another, eating quickly now, almost desperately. When she finished, she looked up at the serving table, then back at her empty plate. The young soldier was still there, ladling out portions. Greta stood up, walked to the front and held out her plate. "More?" she asked in halting English. "Please?" The soldier grinned and served her another generous portion. "Enjoy," he said. She carried it back to the table like treasure. Sophie was crying. Silent tears streamed down her face while she ate slowly, methodically, each bite deliberate. Her hands shook slightly. "It's too sweet," Sophie whispered. "It's too much. I can't. But she kept eating, fork to mouth, tears falling onto the plate. Heidi had stopped eating after a few bites. She sat frozen, staring at her cobbler, her face pale. "I keep thinking about my brother," she said quietly. "About all the children. They should have this. Everyone should have this. Greta reached over and squeezed her hand. Maybe someday they will. At the next table, a Japanese woman was also trying the cobbler. She was older, maybe 40, with gray streaking her dark hair. She took a small bite, her expression thoughtful, then turned to her daughter, a teenager with long braids, and said something in Japanese. The girl tried it and smiled. The woman caught Greta's eye. For a moment, they looked at each other across the divide of language and nationality and circumstance. Then the woman smiled, a small, sad smile, and nodded. Greta nodded back. They understood each other. They were both far from home. They were both prisoners of a war they hadn't started. They were both tasting something sweet in a world that had been bitter for so long. Around the mess hall, similar scenes played out. An elderly German man wept openly, his wife patting his hand and crying herself. Children devoured their portions and begged for more, their faces sticky with syrup. A group of women passed forks around, sharing bites, laughing and crying at the same time. The American guards watched from the edges of the room. Some looked moved, some looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Patterson stood near the kitchen, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Greta finished her second portion and sat back, feeling almost sick from the richness of it. Her stomach, unused to such abundance, protested. But she didn't care. For this moment, she was full. For this moment, she had tasted something beautiful. That night, back in the barracks, the three of them lay on their cots in the darkness, too full to move comfortably. "I can't believe that was real," Greta said. "Tomorrow I'll wake up and think I dreamed it." Sophie's voice came soft from the next bed. "My grandmother would have cried for this. She died last winter. From hunger, really. The rations weren't enough. She just got weaker and weaker until—" She trailed off. Greta heard her crying quietly in the darkness. "Is it wrong?" Heidi asked suddenly. "To enjoy this? While people back home are starving?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Greta thought about it, turning it over in her mind. Was it wrong? Was she betraying her family, her country, by being grateful for American kindness? "We didn't choose this," Sophie said finally. "We didn't ask to be here. But we are here, and we're alive, and we're fed. Maybe we can remember that kindness exists, that abundance is possible. When we go back, if we go back, we'll remember that the world doesn't have to be what we were told it was." Greta thought about that. The world doesn't have to be what we were told it was. All her life she'd been taught that America was weak, decadent, corrupt, that Germans were superior, destined to rule, that sacrifice and suffering were noble, necessary, the price of greatness. But here she was, a prisoner in America, fed better than she'd been fed in Germany, given butter and sugar and peach cobbler by the very people she'd been taught to despise. It didn't fit the narrative. Nothing fit the narrative anymore. In the days that followed, the cobbler became a turning point. Something shifted in the camp, or maybe just in Greta's perception of it. She began to engage more with the daily routines, to see the camp not just as a prison, but as a strange, temporary community. She volunteered for extra kitchen duty, watching the American cooks work, learning their methods. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Betty, taught her how to make biscuits. Flour, butter, milk, baking powder, mixed quickly and baked hot. They came out fluffy and tender, nothing like the dense German rolls Greta had grown up with. "Can you make cobbler with less sugar?" Greta asked one day, her English improving slowly. For after war, in Germany, Betty considered this. "Sure, honey, you can adjust it. Use less sugar, maybe add a little honey if you have it. The important thing is the fruit and the crust. The sweetness is just extra, extra." In Germany, nothing had been extra for years. Everything had been rationed, measured, stretched as far as it would go. The idea of extra was almost incomprehensible. Sophie threw herself into her English lessons with renewed focus. She practiced with Mrs. Patterson after class, asking questions, taking notes in her diary. "Perhaps America is not the enemy we were told it was," she wrote one evening. Greta read it over her shoulder and said nothing. Heidi befriended the Japanese woman from the next table, Mrs. Tanaka, she learned, interned with her family from Peru even though they'd lived there for 20 years. Mrs. Tanaka's daughter, Yuki, was 16, shy and serious. She and Heidi would sit together in the evenings, sharing stories in broken English, their common language of displacement. One afternoon, Heidi came back to the barracks excited. "Mrs. Tanaka is teaching me to make onigiri," she announced. "Rice balls. They're simple but good. She said when the war is over, when we all go home, we should remember each other's food. Remember each other's food. As if food could be a bridge, a way to hold on to humanity when everything else was stripped away." The women began pooling their canteen scrip, saving up to buy ingredients. They wanted to try making cobbler themselves, in the barracks' small shared kitchen. It became a project, something to look forward to, a way to reclaim some agency in their confined lives. They bought canned peaches, 2 cans, carefully chosen, flour, sugar, less than Mrs. Patterson had used, but still more than they would have dreamed of in Germany, butter, cinnamon. On a Sunday afternoon, they gathered in the kitchen with several other German women. Frau Weber helped, her experienced hands guiding them through the process. Mix the dry ingredients, cut in the butter, layer the peaches, pour the batter. Their cobbler wasn't as perfect as Mrs. Patterson's. The crust was too thick in some places, too thin in others. The sugar ratio was off, making it less sweet but somehow more honest. But it was theirs. They had made it themselves in this strange place, with ingredients they'd bought with money they'd earned. When it came out of the oven, they cut it into squares and shared it with everyone in the barracks. German families, a few Italian women, even Mrs. Tanaka and Yuki from next door. They sat together in the common area, eating cobbler and talking in a mixture of languages. And for a moment the fences seemed less important. Sophie began writing letters home. She didn't know if they would ever arrive. Mail service to Germany was sporadic at best, and she wasn't even sure her sister was still alive. But she wrote anyway, describing Texas, the heat, the camp, the strange kindness of their captors. "Today we had a dessert called peach cobbler," she wrote. "It was so sweet I cried. I thought of grandmother, of how she would have loved it. I thought of you and hoped you were eating something, anything. I am safe here. I am fed. I don't know if I should be grateful or ashamed." Greta wrote to her parents in Bavaria. Her father was too old for the army, but he'd been conscripted for labor service, digging trenches. Her mother and sister were alone on the farm. "The Americans feed us better than we fed ourselves before the war," she wrote. "I don't understand it, but I'm grateful. Please tell me you're safe. Please tell me you have enough to eat." Heidi wrote to her brother in Berlin, if he was still alive, if the letter would ever reach him. "When you taste real sugar again, think of me," she wrote. "I'm safe. I'm fed. I hope you are too. I hope you survived. I hope someday you can taste peach cobbler and understand why I cried." The letters went out into the void, carried by uncertain postal routes through a devastated continent. Greta didn't know if hers would arrive. She didn't know if her family was alive to receive it. But she sent it anyway, because what else could she do? The weeks passed. Summer deepened, the Texas heat becoming almost unbearable. The gardens flourished under the brutal sun. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, melons. The Japanese family's plots produced strange and wonderful vegetables. The German section grew potatoes and cabbage and beans, familiar foods that tasted like home. In the evenings after work and dinner, the women would sit outside their barracks, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The guard towers were dark silhouettes against the fading light. Somewhere beyond the fences, America went on with its life, vast and incomprehensible. "Do you think we'll ever eat like this again?" Greta asked one evening. "After we go home?" Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Germany will rebuild. It has to. But it will take years, maybe decades. Maybe that's the point," Heidi said softly. "The cobbler wasn't just food. It was hope, proof that life can be sweet again." Greta thought about that. Hope. She'd almost forgotten what that felt like. For so long, there had been only survival, only getting through each day. But the cobbler had reminded her that there was more to life than just surviving. That sweetness existed. That abundance was possible. "When I go home," she said slowly, "I'm going to open a bakery. I'm going to make bread and cakes and pastries. And I'm going to make cobbler, with plums maybe, since we don't have peaches. And I'm going to remember this. All of this." Sophie smiled in the darkness. "That sounds nice. What about you?" Greta asked. "I don't know. If my sister is alive, if there's anything left of Hamburg, maybe I'll teach again. Maybe I'll stay here. I don't know. "I want to write about this," Heidi said. "Someday, when it's over, when we're old and this is history, I want to write it down, so people remember, so they know what it was like." They sat in silence, watching the stars come out, the same stars that shone over Germany, over the ruins and the refugees and the slow, painful work of rebuilding, the same stars that had watched the world tear itself apart and now watched it try to piece itself back together. Crystal City internment camp would remain open until January 1948. Some internees would leave before then, repatriated to their home countries or released to sponsors in America. Others would stay for years, caught in the bureaucratic limbo of post-war processing. Greta would eventually return to Bavaria in 1946. She would find her family alive but struggling, the farm barely functional, the village half empty. She would use what she'd learned in Texas to help them rebuild. And in the 1950s, when things were finally stable again, she would open a small bakery. She would make bread and cakes and, in the summer when the plums were ripe, she would make cobbler. It was never quite as sweet as the American version, but it was hers, and it carried the memory of an impossible kindness. Sophie would stay in America. She would meet a German-American man from Texas, a teacher like herself, and they would marry in 1947. She would teach English as a second language for 30 years, helping other immigrants find their footing in this strange, abundant country. She would keep her diary from Crystal City her entire life, and after her death, her children would donate it to a museum. Heidi would return to Berlin in 1947. She would find her brother alive, thin and traumatized, but alive. They would work together in the reconstruction efforts, clearing rubble, rebuilding homes, slowly piecing their city back together. In the 1980s, she would write a memoir. One chapter would be titled, "The Sweetest Day." It would describe the peach cobbler in detail, the taste, the texture, the impossible sweetness of it. It would describe crying in a Texas mess hall, surrounded by other prisoners, tasting kindness from the hands of enemies. But all of that was still to come. For now, they sat outside their barracks in the warm Texas night, 3 young women far from home, trying to make sense of a world that had turned upside down. "I'll never forget the taste of that cobbler," Greta said quietly. "None of us will," Sophie replied. And they didn't. Years later, decades later, when they were old women with grandchildren and the war was history, they would still remember. They would remember the heat of Texas, the fences and guard towers, the strange community of displaced people trying to survive. They would remember the kindness of American cooks who fed their prisoners well. They would remember Mrs. Patterson teaching them to make bread. They would remember Mrs. Tanaka sharing rice balls. They would remember the young soldier with red hair who gave them second helpings without being asked. But most of all, they would remember the peach cobbler, the impossible sweetness of it, the way it made them cry, the way it reminded them that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of war and loss and displacement, there could still be moments of grace, small kindnesses that crossed borders and bridged divides, simple pleasures that made life worth living. The cobbler was more than just dessert. It was a symbol, a promise, a tiny seed of hope planted in the hard soil of their hearts. It said, "The world doesn't have to be cruel. Abundance is possible. Sweetness exists. Life can be good again." And in the end, that was the lesson they carried with them. Not the bitterness of defeat or the shame of being on the wrong side of history, but the memory of unexpected kindness, the knowledge that even enemies can show mercy, the understanding that food, simple, nourishing, delicious food, can be an act of love. They would carry that lesson home with them, back to a devastated Germany that needed rebuilding not just in brick and steel, but in spirit and hope. They would carry it through the hard years of reconstruction, through the cold winters and the hunger, and the slow, painful work of creating something new from the ruins of the old. And sometimes, when they made cobbler for their families, with plums or apples or whatever fruit they could find, they would close their eyes and remember. They would remember Texas and the heat and the fences. They would remember crying in a mess hall overwhelmed by sweetness. They would remember that once, when they were young and lost and far from home, someone had shown them kindness. That memory would sustain them. It would remind them that the world could be better than it was, that people could be better than they were, that even in the aftermath of the worst war in human history, there was still room for grace. The peach cobbler was a small thing, really. Just fruit and sugar and butter and crust, baked until golden and served warm. But small things can carry enormous weight. Small kindnesses can change lives. And sometimes the most profound lessons come not from grand gestures or sweeping changes, but from simple moments of shared humanity. 3 women, far from home, tasting sweetness in a bitter world, remembering that kindness exists, holding on to hope. That was the story of the peach cobbler. That was the lesson they learned in Crystal City, Texas in the spring of 1945, when the war was ending and the world was beginning again. And it was a lesson worth remembering. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We bring you more untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered. If you're already part of our community, hit that like button to help others discover these powerful moments from the past. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where food became more than just sustenance? Where a simple meal carried unexpected meaning? Share your thoughts below. Your engagement helps us continue uncovering these forgotten chapters of history. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.